Hello, can everybody hear me? All right, we know you're clapping for Susan and me, but you should be nice to the congressman anyway. Thank you for coming. We're very glad to be here. This has been a wonderful few days, and I can't think of a better way to end it than with this conversation we're going to have with Adam Schiff. As a congressman I knew once said, he is a man who deserves no introduction. That's the way the congressman put it. But obviously, I think everybody in this room knows Adam Schiff pretty well, longtime congressman from Southern California, recently announced candidate for United States Senate, former member of the former member of the January 6th committee, of course. So Susan and I got to tag team the congressman here today. He may not appreciate it. We're getting him from both sides. But we're going to start with his other title as former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Because as we all know, today, somewhere over the Midwest is a Chinese spy balloon heading its way, we know not where. And I wondered, as a former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, if you could tell us a little bit about what you think of this. What is our exposure? What kind of balloon find out from us that a satellite couldn't? And has this happened before in your experience, or is this a new thing?
Well, there are, I think, certainly some things that a lower flying balloon than a satellite can glean that a satellite can't. But it's quite an in-your-face demonstration of China's aggression, that they would take the risk of being discovered, as indeed they were. They would have to know that there was a high likelihood of discovery. And one of the things that we have seen over the years from the intel perspective is that in almost every domain, really every domain, whether it is in the air, at sea, in the cyber realm, in development assistance, China is a growing power to be contended with. And as we have kind of fiddled and burned during the prior administration, it wasn't like the rest of the world was standing still. They were advancing, and China more than any other nation. So this is a very powerful competitor, rival, and I think probably more than anything else, what we can see in this surveillance craft is that while China, for much of its history, was very inward-looking, and its foreign policy didn't extend much beyond the South China Sea, it is no longer at all inward-looking. It is very outward-looking. It believes that it has every right to a dominant place on the world stage, and it believes that it will surpass the United States. And I think that unless we make very different decisions about how we educate our own people, about the investment or lack of investment traditionally in sciences, which we have started to change, then we are at risk of China overtaking us in certain critical areas.
Agreed, but what about the balloon? Should we shoot it down? There's a lot of armchair generals out there on Twitter who think we should just blast it out of the sky. I mean, it has almost a Cold War redux feel to it, doesn't it?
If it could be shot down without risking people on the ground, I'd say shoot it down. And I would say shoot it down in a way where you don't obliterate it so that you can study what kind of capacity it has. That could provide some valuable insights to us. I assume that if the administration is not shooting it down, it's for fear that the debris might be hard to prevent, inflicting injury on the ground. But we should have no hesitation, but for the safety of our own people, to take action when a foreign nation violates our airspace that way.
Well, when we talk about foreign threats today, let's continue on that subject a little longer. Russia obviously is the central character right now in our confrontation in Europe over the fate of Ukraine. What is your take on the Biden administration's handling of this? Have they been, in your view, too slow, too hesitant to provide some of the arms and equipment that Ukrainians want on tanks, on aircraft? Would you urge them to do more faster than they have been?
It's a great question, and I was very proud to join Speaker Pelosi for the first Codel to Kyiv during the war. We sat down with President Zelensky, who I had never met, although I had studied a lot about him during the first impeachment. I felt like I knew him. And I was struck by a number of things. I was most struck by the fact that Here was this former sitcom star who played a sitcom star who becomes the president of his country in a case of life imitating art to the most bizarre degree. And there he was going through the battlefield with us as if this was how he had always been trained, with an extraordinary understanding of what they needed militarily, of what the Russians were doing, about the dangers to his country, which just goes to show you, never underestimate a Jewish comic. But we came back from that meeting, and we immediately met with President Biden. We debriefed him on our meeting, and we made the case for those HIMARS, those multiple launch rocket systems that they had been asking for, really urging our country to provide, and we have provided them to great effect. But one thing that became very clear in the meeting with President Biden, and I think he has handled this conflict almost flawlessly, is while members of Congress, myself very much included, have continually been pressing the administration to do more, to provide more advanced equipment, because the Ukrainian fight is really our fight, and it's a fight for democracy. The president made it clear that he understood exactly that critical importance of this fight, but also that it was very easy for those of us in Congress to be urging the administration to do more, that if we got into a hot shooting war with the Russians, though, the responsibility would be his. And I think he is very mindful of providing Ukraine every bit of assistance we can, just short of provoking a direct confrontation with Russia. And I think he's handled that just brilliantly, and I give him a lot of credit, second only to the extraordinary courage that the Ukrainians have demonstrated. And you know, one other hesitation I think we had in terms of some of the sophisticated weapon systems was how quickly could they use them? Would they be restrained in using them in the sense of not, attacking targets with our equipment in Russia? And they have done just a magnificent job. They have just been incredible.
Yeah, no, it's hard to believe that it's already been 1 year. February 24th is the anniversary, and really, of course, this is a kind of a before and after moment, right? This is the biggest land war in Europe since the end of World War II. It's clearly going to reshape geopolitics and certainly European security for a generation to come. I guess I want to ask one thing, if we were having this conversation a year ago, we might not have realized, that this was also going to be a moment of the return of, kind of nuclear brinkmanship to geopolitics in a real way, that we're having conversations now that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Peter and I have made a habit of asking, administration officials, national security officials, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you about the possibility of some kind of nuclear weapons use? Any other point in our lives after maybe 1986, the answer would have been 0, maybe 1 at the most. That has not been the answer that we've been getting from many senior national security officials. And I'm just curious, what's your number right now?
Well, first I would say that for me the number never went down to 0. But my predominant concern up until the present was the risk of an accidental exchange. That the degree to which the Russians had their nuclear missiles, not on a, well, it's colloquially called a hair trigger, it's not really a hair trigger, but on very short notice, that there was a very distinct possibility, and still remains a distinct possibility, of an accidental fire of a missile, or that we misinterpret something as a first use. That has been far eclipsed by the situation with Russia. The degree to which Putin recklessly, dangerously talks about the use of nuclear weapons has shattered another norm, another taboo. And with someone as with as little regard for human life as Vladimir Putin, you can never exclude the possibility that they would use a tactical nuclear weapon. I think that we would see signs of escalation well before it got to that point. So that gives me some hope that we won't wake up and see reports of a mushroom cloud, that we will have some advance notice before things are getting to the point where that's even possible. But the fact that we can't exclude it is terrifying enough. If I had to give it a number, I would probably give it a 7.
That is not reassuring, folks.
Well, and I'm not saying that means it's more probable than not. That's not the scale I mean, but in terms of my level of concern, 1 to 10, if I was a 2 before, I'm probably a 7 now.
Okay, wow. We think of Vladimir Putin, you mentioned Vladimir Putin, and one of the most indelible moments of the last few years involving President Putin was standing next to President Trump in Helsinki, of course, and in which the former president of the United States, then the president of the United States, said he trusted Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence agencies. This week, he doubled down on that. I don't know if you might have missed that. Your Truth Social account may have expired, but on Truth Social, he put out a statement saying he would still trust Putin over intelligence agencies led by the likes of Jim Comey and John Brennan. What is that? I mean, you've studied President Trump and Russia. What does that tell you in your mind about his relationship with Putin and Russia?
Well, I've always thought that with respect to the former president and Russia, that the compromise was out in the open in 2 respects. The first is, and I remember the president about 9 months into office, the former president, 9 months into office, he's confronted with a lie he told, one of the many lies he told during the presidential campaign of 2016, the one about having no business dealings with the Russians. It took enterprising journalists, because we didn't discover this in Congress, you were ahead of us, about 6 months or 9 months into the administration to discover, no, actually, he was negotiating with the Kremlin to build a Moscow Trump Tower right up until the Republican convention. That would have been the most lucrative deal of his life. In the Mueller report, the Mueller team identified that it could have earned him hundreds of millions of dollars. That tower would have not only been the tallest in Moscow, but the tallest in Europe, in all of Europe. And he was on the phone, Michael Cohen, his lawyer at the time, on the phone with the Kremlin, asking for their help, knowing that there was no way that deal would be consummated without Putin's approval. So 9 months into office, he's confronted on the White House grounds. He's standing next to Marine One helicopter, his hair unnaturally unmoved by its rotors. And he's asked, "What about that, Mr. President? You said you had no business dealings with the Russians, and now we find out about this." And for someone who lied constantly, he could also be very transparent, usually when he didn't realize how damning what he was about to say truly was. And his answer was something along the lines of, well, it wasn't like I was talking to a magistrate. I was just lying to the public. What's the big deal? But then, more to the point, he says, I might have lost the election. Why would I miss out on all those opportunities? And to me, that was a real insight into him. Because I think that same perspective occupied his entire time in the White House. That is, I might lose my reelection. I still want that business opportunity. I would be crazy to insult the man who would basically determine whether I made all that money. And anyone else who feels differently is just a loser. I do think that that in some respects, Trump and Mueller had different blind spots, but maybe owing to a similar phenomenon in that Donald Trump, because he lied so pathologically, believed everyone was the same. Because he cared nothing about himself, he believed everyone was the same. Bob Mueller is a person of such integrity, I think that he presumed that others, like Bill Barr, had the same level of integrity and proved to be blind to what Barr would do with his report. But the other aspect of Trump that makes him so dangerous vis-a-vis Russia is another element of his character that is so obvious to see, and that is all you have to do is compliment the guy. He will continually say, well, Putin has nice things to say about me. And you know, foreign leaders do the same thing we do. We analyze their leaders, they analyze ours. We do psychiatric profiles, they do psychiatric profiles. You don't need to be a genius to see if you flatter Donald Trump, you can get just about anything. And so I'm not surprised that he is still saying good things about Putin, that he is still preferring Putin to his own intelligence agencies. But one final point, and that is when Donald Trump so denigrates our intelligence agencies, when he denigrates the people in the FBI, when the Jim Jordans and the McCarthys set up this select committee on the weaponization of the federal government, they tear down those institutions. And, you know, Will Rollins is here, wonderful Will Rollins. And he and I both served in the U.S. Attorney's Office. You know, during those Trump years when he was tearing down the FBI, I would talk to assistant U.S. attorneys, friends of mine in different offices around the country, and I would ask them, what's the impact of this? I mean, do defense counsel go into the courtroom now and say that their client is only being investigated because it's a witch hunt, because it's all politics, because they stood up to the deep state? And the answer is yes. The FBI is being impeached by our own former president. And so it has a real consequence on the ability of intelligence agencies to get cooperating sources of information. It has impacts on the ability of the FBI to prosecute cases and bring people to justice, quite separate and apart from the destructive endorsement Trump keeps making of the Kremlin dictator.
So you mentioned impeachment, and I think, you know, we've all spent a lot of time sort of wrestling with what ultimately resulted from not one but two impeachments, both of which you were very deeply involved with, that House Democrats, you know, essentially sought to use this tool that the Constitution gives to impose a certain accountability on the president. There's a lot of people, my guess is if I asked for a show of hands here, whether people felt that Donald Trump had been held accountable for what he did when he was in office, probably people would not feel that way. And, you know, one of my fears, just looking at the record here, is that, in fact, what we've actually learned from 4 years of skirmishes between Congress and the executive and Donald Trump would be that it's almost basically impossible to impeach and remove from office a rogue president, given the polarized state of the politics and the way in which party line voting rather than institutional voting has come to dominate the Senate. And I'm just curious, what are your takeaways from the efforts so far, not necessarily successful, to impose a form of accountability on the former president?
It's a great question. I think I have two takeaways. The first is that we faced the decision in the House, and I think we made the right decision, that regardless of whether the Senate would do its institutional duty, regardless of whether senators would fulfill their oath of office, we had a duty to fulfill ours. And if we witnessed a president committing impeachable conduct, then he should be impeached. And I suspect for those of you who feel like Donald Trump has still not been held accountable, and I would include myself in that category, you would feel even more so had we not impeached him, had we not, in the House at least, held him accountable. But the broader conclusion I would reach after two impeachments and an insurrection is that you can have the best written Constitution in the world, and I believe that we do. You can have the best written laws meant to constrain the worst impulses of human nature, and maybe we do. And none of it will be enough if people don't give meaning to their oath of office. None of it will be enough if people don't recognize facts and truth, and if they're unwilling to distinguish between right and wrong. Then none of it will be enough. You know, I had two terrible epiphanies, at least two, during the Trump years. The first was that the predominant danger to our democracy now came from within. Now, this seems sadly self-evident now, but in the first year of the Trump presidency, it was a really shocking conclusion to reach. That had never been the case for anyone in the post-World War II period. But now the predominant threat came from within. And the second epiphany was that so many people that I worked with, so many people that I admired and respected among my GOP colleagues, because I believed that they believed what they were saying, turned out not to believe it at all. Or if they did believe it, none of it quite mattered. At the end of the day, so much as keeping their party in power or keeping their own position. This is not a flaw in the impeachment remedy. I wouldn't recommend that we change impeachment to a majority vote and become a kind of a parliament. No, this is a flaw in the character of the people that we have elected to office. You know, I quote Robert Caro a lot these days, the historian, for what he said about power. He said, power doesn't corrupt as much as it reveals. It doesn't always reveal us for our best, but it says a lot about who we are. And I think over the last several years, power has revealed a lot about the people who serve in government. It revealed Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger to be people of great courage and conviction. It also revealed them to be in the very small minority of their party at this moment in time. It also revealed something about the country, though, about a deep vein of bigotry that's run through the country since its founding, a deep vein of bigotry that is open to be exploited by any demagogue. And that is something that we are going to have to pay deep attention to as well. I was there on January 6th, not just for the committee, but for the day itself. Among the worst images of that day were the Confederate flags and the Auschwitz T-shirts, because that said to me, this is not just a Trumpist insurrection, this is also a white nationalist insurrection. And that the road back for this country, and maybe even back is not the right expression, but the healing, and in order to move the country forward was going to be a lot more difficult and long-term in nature than if this were just a bunch of disgruntled, extreme MAGA people.
I wouldn't say we've seen a lot of healing yet in this new calendar year as we see a new Congress come in, though. One of the first things they did was to throw you off the House Intelligence Committee.
And I would say I've been thrown off better committees than that,
yeah.
but honestly, I never have.
Yeah. It's a pretty good committee, I would think. They don't let journalists on it. Unfortunately, we would love to have access to some of the things that you have had access to. But the allegation that they made is that you were too free with making assertions about President Trump's relationship with Russia that turned out not to be true, that you asserted collusion that Mueller's report did not in fact back up, that you were loose with the truth in effect in making these allegations. Do you regret anything you say? Was there anything you would take back? Would you word it differently? Do you think maybe it could have been more precise? What do you think of that today?
No, I wouldn't change anything, but it does show the degree to which the GOP is really good on consistent messaging, and the degree to which they're capable of gaslighting the country. You know what the Mueller report said about collusion? It said, we state no conclusion as to whether Trump colluded with Russia. We're only going to address whether we can prove beyond reasonable doubt the crime of conspiracy. That is exactly the same thing I said before the Mueller report. We have to distinguish between collusion and criminal conspiracy. But here's what Mueller did find, and what we found in our investigation, which I think the American people overwhelmingly would find to be collusion as we understand that term. We found that Donald Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, during the campaign was secretly meeting with an agent of Russian intelligence and providing Russian intelligence with internal polling data, with their strategy for battleground states, while that same unit of Russian intelligence was hacking emails from Hillary Clinton's campaign and dumping them through cutouts, while they were mounting a social media campaign to denigrate Hillary Clinton and elect Donald Trump, for which that polling data and battleground information would be very useful. Now, most people would say that that is the worst form of collusion. Now, you may not be able to prove all the elements of criminal conspiracy, but similarly, when the Russians in writing, through an intermediary, offer dirt on Hillary Clinton. And the reaction at the highest levels of the Trump campaign, including the president's son, Don Jr., is, if it's what you say it is, we would love it. And by the way, the best timing is in late summer. And that's when they start dumping the stolen emails. Yeah, that's evidence of collusion. But the former president's mantra of no collusion, no obstruction has been repeated so endlessly as to have been very effective. I'll share one anecdote with you that I shared in the book because to me it was so telling. I was flying through one of the Carolinas, and I left the airport to wait for my Uber, and this guy comes up to me at the curb, and he says, you're Adam Schiff, right? And I said, yes, and he said, you can tell me. There's nothing to this collusion stuff, right? And I said, let me ask you a question. Let's say that I told you that the Russians approached not the Trump campaign, but the Clinton campaign. Let's say that they wrote to the Clinton campaign, to Chelsea Clinton, and said, we have dirt on Donald Trump, and we can provide it to you as part of, quote, the Russian government's effort to help the Clinton campaign. And let's say that instead of Chelsea reporting this to the FBI, her response was, well, if it's what you say it is, we'd love it. And then she sets up a secret meeting in the Brooklyn headquarters with John Podesta and Robbie Mook, the head of the Clinton campaign, to receive the dirt. And their only disappointment is that the dirt they got at that meeting wasn't better. And then let's say the Clinton campaign lied about it and said the meeting never happened. And then when they were found out, they lied again and said, no, but the meeting was about adoptions when it was about the dirt they hoped to get. Would you call that collusion? And the guy looks at me and says, I think I see where you're going here. And, I gave him another example, and then he said, you know something? I probably would call it collusion. And I thought, eureka. Now if I can just talk to 100 million people at the airport, we can get this point across.
Well, if you fly Southwest, you may have time. Talk to them all.
All right, so we've established that Trump is good at marketing and good at Twitter, and so are you, in many ways. I think many people here remember your speeches during impeachment as being a sort of indelible and even prediction, in some ways of what would happen in the wake of Trump's acquittal in 2020. Maybe everybody here just prefers to forget about 2020 and move on from it. But the House is where you have made your career for a long time. You've now decided to move on. I'm wondering to what extent it's possible even to, operate in the House the way it was when you came into it. I'm really struck that your case was twinned. They didn't just throw you and your colleague from California, Eric Swalwell, off of the Intelligence Committee. It was also tied to the case of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And they actually voted to take her off the House Foreign Affairs Committee, arguably for viewpoints she expressed, anti-Semitic in the view of many viewpoints. Do you think, that's the right decision if somebody has anti-Semitic views? Would you support, for example, taking Congressman Steve King off of the House Foreign Affairs Committee for that? And also, are we in some kind of a spiral now, right? This is all retaliation, as your Republican colleagues see it, for the January 6th committee proceeding without the Republican members that Kevin McCarthy wanted to put on it.
First of all, I think we need to look at what the precedent was that was set in the last Congress when Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar were removed from their committees. They were removed from their committees with a bipartisan vote because they had encouraged violence against other members. And that is a very specific precedent to set. I think that was the right precedent. And I think it was also important that it was bipartisan. The case involving what the Republicans have done this year with myself and Mr. Swalwell and with Ilhan Omar, first of all, the reason why they could remove myself and Swalwell from the Intelligence Committee was that it doesn't require a House vote. The Intelligence Committee is a select committee, and therefore the Speaker has the last word. Now, the Speaker, Speaker Pelosi, could have removed Devin Nunes from the committee at any time. She did not. And there were lots of reasons why Devin Nunes was not the right person to chair the Intel Committee or even be the ranking member. So I think there is a fundamental false equivalence that McCarthy is arguing when he cites that precedent last session from this session. I would remove people. I would remove my own Democratic colleagues if they were inciting violence against other members. And you know, as someone who over the last several years has received more than most members of Congress in the category of death threats to myself, to my wife, to my kids, I take the issue of our safety very seriously, and I think we have to. There is all too much acceptance these days of the idea of political violence. And so I think these are very distinguishable cases. And in the case of Ilhan Omar, a couple things. First, she has apologized for the remarks that she made, but it is so clearly a pretext, what McCarthy is doing, to placate members of her conference. Because let's not forget, the party leader that Kevin McCarthy bows fealty to every day, Donald Trump, is dining with anti-Semites and white nationalists. His own members, these two in particular, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar, speak at white nationalist conventions. You cannot tell me, with their members engaging in that kind of conduct, that this really has something to do with anti-Semitism. What it really has to do is gratifying their base. It has a lot to do with fundraising, and it has to do with, well, Marjorie Taylor Greene wants revenge. Kevin McCarthy needs Marjorie Taylor Greene to become Speaker or to stay Speaker. Therefore, she's going to get what she wants.
I think you make a good point about analyzing the politics of why he's done what he's done. But I do want to come back to Susan's point, because what you said now, you articulate a standard by which you say, okay, if they have articulated violence, that is a fair reason to remove somebody from a committee. Okay, I get that. But Speaker McCarthy, when he was the minority leader, did remove Steve King from committees for nothing other than racist comments. Comments were perceived to be racist. He didn't urge violence. He simply said to the New York Times, in fact, that he thought white nationalism wasn't such a terrible thing. Is that something that, as you think about it now, he didn't urge violence, is that something that somebody should be removed from a committee for? Because what she did say was offensive to many people, and many people do think of her as a continuing anti-Semite, even though she has apologized, as you say. Or is an apology enough to get you off the hook when you say something? Where's the standard, I guess I'm asking you for?
Well, I think there probably are different circumstances between when a party takes action against its own, which I think under those circumstances the party has more latitude to do so, and circumstances in which a party seeks to take a member of the other party off of their committees. And so I think each party ought to have the right to make decisions about how they police their own members, whether they use remedies of ethics complaints, or they use remedies of removal from committee, or they use the remedies of expulsion from the House. But if you're going to take a purely partisan action against a member, then it ought to meet the highest threshold. And in the case of last session, it wasn't a purely partisan effort. It was a bipartisan effort, and I think it met that highest threshold.
All right, so you're leaving the House behind now. So presumably they'll let you back on the committees if you win this seat. So let's talk about this Senate race. You've jumped in, you've had a big start to it. You had Speaker Pelosi, former Speaker Pelosi, endorsing you along with many other members of the delegation this week. You clearly have some support here in California. That's a good thing. I want to know a couple things, but let's start out with the sort of basic question. The incumbent, Dianne Feinstein, has not actually said that she's not running yet, and I know you've said that you spoke with her. Can you explain to us how we're threading this needle at this point? Your actions and that of Nancy Pelosi and the others suggest that you all have a pretty strong view that Senator Feinstein is not running. Are you staying in the race if she is running?
You know, I sat down with Senator Feinstein some weeks ago to let her know that I was interested in exploring a run for the Senate at that time. And we have worked together very closely over the years. When I was the lead Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, she was the lead Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I'll never forget early in 2016 getting a call from Senator Feinstein about what we were seeing the Russians do to intervene to help Donald Trump become the next president of the United States. And her asking me over the phone, over a secure phone, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And my answer was yes. Are you as alarmed by it as I am? And my answer was yes. And, you know, I feel like we went through those wars together. And I wanted to make sure in even exploring a run, even starting to talk to people 2 months ago, that I didn't do anything that would take her by surprise, and that I showed her the respect that she had earned. And she could not have been more gracious. She made it clear then, as she did, and I spoke with her again right before I announced my campaign, really for much the same reason. She made it clear that she had plenty of work that she wanted to finish in the Senate, that she was certainly going to complete her term, and that beyond that, she wasn't prepared to make a decision. And I told her I respect that. I was certainly not going to be trying to tell Senator Feinstein what her timetable should be. I think she has gotten to where she is and accomplished what she has because she has not let other people tell her what she can and cannot do. At the same time, I think the issues facing the country are urgent. And the issues facing our state are urgent, and I wanted to be out there talking to people about them. And the two issues I talked to the Senator about are the first that we've been discussing, and that is the danger to our democracy. But the other issue to me, which is completely intertwined with the danger facing our democracy, is the fact that the economy simply hasn't worked for millions of Americans. To me, this is one of the existential issues of our time. And you might say, well, how can that be? We just got new unemployment numbers, and it's the lowest in decades, and we created over 500,000 jobs. And all of that is great, except for the fact that many of those jobs don't provide enough of an income for people to live. And this is the result, I think, of conscious choices that we have made over the last several decades. My Republican colleagues like to ascribe everyone's success or failure as the result of Adam Smith's invisible hand. It isn't an invisible hand. It's generally a very visible hand that is making these decisions. Sometimes the very visible hand of a special interest. But when we, for example, during the pandemic, more than doubled the size of the child tax credit, the effect of it was to lift 40% of the kids in poverty in the country out of poverty. That's an astounding thing. A simple change to the tax code lifted 40% of the kids out of poverty. And I think it should tell us that this doesn't require some great, brilliant insight as a policy matter. It ought to tell us that it's really a decision we've made about how much poverty we're willing to accept. When almost half the people who are homeless in our state are working full-time, there's a structural problem in the economy. And at a certain point, when the economy and when the democracy isn't delivering for millions of people, they start to entertain other models. And, we started the conversation talking about China. While we were self-immolating, China was going around the world holding up the image of people climbing on top of the U.S. Capitol and saying democracy doesn't work. You should adopt the China model. And we should be very clear, the China model is totalitarianism. This is not an alternative to democracy. But we are in a real struggle around the world, not between communism and capitalism anymore, but between democracy and autocracy. And that debate is driven, I think, by these economic challenges and anxiety people at home and around the world so acutely feel.
Now, I recognize this because at home, when Susan asked me a question that I don't want to answer, I answer the question I wish she'd asked me. And you've done a great job just doing that. But she did ask a pretty good question, I thought, right now, which is kind of a yes or no question, which is if Senator Feinstein next month says, I am running again, are you still in the race?
I am.
For the record, he does filibuster a lot.
This may not satisfy you,
I meant Peter,
but I am going to allow Senator Feinstein to make her decision about that. But I have every confidence that she'll make the decision that's right for the state of California.
So, Congressman, one of the many concerns, that we've heard articulated is understandable. Senator Feinstein is age 89 years old. There's a question about her, understandably, whether she's got another 6-year term in her, whether she, wants to do that. I want to ask you about someone you just quoted. That line about autocracies and democracies is one I really do associate with the president, who, as you said, has been very staunch on this since even before he was inaugurated. President Biden right now says that he intends to run for another term. Which, if he won it, he's already the oldest president right now at age 80. If he won and served another 6 years, he would be 86 years old at the end of his presidency. Would you urge him not to run again?
Not at all. And if he decides to run, I'm fully behind him.
So that's an endorsement right now.
Yeah. No, I am perfectly comfortable endorsing him right now if he chooses to run again. I think what the president has been able to achieve, along with the Democrats in Congress over the last 2 years, has been astonishing. With the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the most significant investment in attacking climate change in our history, with the passage of the infrastructure bill and the most significant investment in our infrastructure since Eisenhower, with the CHIPS and Science Act to make this massive investment in bringing back high-tech manufacturing. I mean, the list goes on. And if that's going to be his record, then I'm all for more of that. And I think to your point about age, it really depends on the person. Some people are extremely capable at age 80, and some people are extremely incapable at age 40. And so I would go with those that have a proven ability to deliver rather than fixate on their age.
We're going to wrap this up in just about a minute and a half here. But as you know, there's not a free path to a Senate seat in California or anywhere else, for that matter, probably. This is the first open, if she doesn't run, Senator Feinstein, this would be the first open primary for the Democrats since 1992, I think, for a Senate seat here. Big moment. Our friend Ron Brownstein says that most experts he has spoken with give you a slight edge, but you're not the only one already in the race and not likely to be the only one in the race. What makes you then a better senator than other Democrats like Katie Porter, Barbara Lee, Ro Khanna? You're already hearing, you get criticized by Republicans for being too tough on President Trump. I'm hearing criticism from the left that you weren't fast enough to be tough on him in impeachment the first time around. How do you distinguish yourself from the other Democrats who might run?
And you have 42 seconds.
Well, I know I'm in a competitive race when I'm being criticized for going too easy on Donald Trump. Well, look, whatever Democrats run for this seat, we are rivals under the same flag. And I think at a time when our democracy is at risk, we ought to direct our fire not at each other, but at those that would tear down our democracy. The case I would make for myself is that in each of the central fights that we've had in the last decade over the preservation of our democracy and our way of life, I've been at the center of the fight. Investigating the former president over his Russia misconduct, then over his Ukraine misconduct, leading the first impeachment trial to the first bipartisan vote for conviction in our history, participating in the January 6th committee to expose how close our democracy came to an end, and that work is continuing. And the work that I've been doing that is less visible to champion an economy that works for everyone, I think, is equally important. That's the record I would bring to the Senate, and I think California is used to having a senator who is in the middle of the fight, which is where I've been and where I will continue to be in championing the values of our beloved state.
Well, thank you very much for that. The book is Midnight in Washington, by the way, one of the better books you'll read about Washington. Make sure to pick it up. It's worth reading.
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman, for being in the middle with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.